We are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in our reality occurs. We would have the overwhelming impression that we were reliving the present, déjà vu, perhaps in precisely the same way, hearing the same words, saying the same words. I submit that these impressions are valid and significant, and I will even say this: such an impression is a clue that at some past time point a variable was changed, reprogrammed as it were, and that because of this an alternative world branched off.
Good afternoon, and welcome to yet another edition of Free Association Radio. I am your host, Robert Phoenix, and Fridays is when we stretch out and go as far as we can. It is called the Friday Farcast, and today we are going as far as we can into the future with my guest, Charles Ostman, who I will bring on in just a moment. And Charles is going to break down what's happening right now technologically and some very interesting advances in the fields of food sovereignty, 3D printing, and the materials with which 3D printing is being supplemented by. Just a little bit of the background on Charles and my relationship with him. I met him in 1996 in the Berkeley Hills, and at that time we were both kicking around the world headquarters of MONDO 2000, and Charles was the science editor for MONDO. And Charles was the first person to introduce me to terms like synthetic sentience and artificial intelligence and self-recognition systems. And everything, or pretty much everything that Charles talked about during that time has come to fruition, especially some of the inventions and developments in the world of nanotech and nanobiology, which bring us really to the precipice of some very interesting and at times frightening cusps in our own development and evolution. So we're going to bring Charles on, and we're going to talk about what the future has in store for us in just a moment. I have a new blog post up on our site on robertphoenix.com. It's about Turkey and the generation that was born in 1990. And why they're holding all the cards right now in a very, very flammable, combustible situation in Turkey, in a situation, by the way, which is not anything like an Arab Spring. This is very different. So if you want to read about that, go to my website, robertphoenix.com. Okay, we've only got him for an hour. Maybe hopefully we can squeeze a few more minutes out of him because he's a vault of information. Let's bring him on. He's the smartest man in the world, according to my son. It's Charles Ostman. Hello, Charles.
Hi, Robert. How are you doing?
I'm really, really good. How are you doing?
I'm actually quite ecstatic. I've moved from Berkeley to Sebastopol, which is in the center of wine country. I'm surrounded by vineyards in all directions, although I don't drink, so it's kind of ironic. But I get lots of Facebook and email traffic from literally all over the planet, from all of the different associates I have, constantly telling me, Charles, you're only 3.6 miles from the whatever winery. You got to try the vintage such and such. And I'm saying, well, that's nice to know, but it's kind of funny in a way. But it's actually quite interesting because I work full time now in an R&D lab where we're really trying to push the sort of far frontier, if I can use that set of words, in how we can optimize growing plants, both for medicinal and food purposes. with the least amount of resources in the smallest amount of surface area possible. And we're very big on the idea of urban agriculture. I often use the term victory gardens of the 21st century because, as you may recall, certainly in your parents' time during World War II, there were these victory gardens. Virtually every family, every small community had their little victory gardens or sort of mini farms. And people were very big on self-sufficiency in that context. And we were in the middle of a war, fighting against Japan and Germany. Well, I would submit to you that now we're sort of in a different kind of war, and I'm using that word somewhat carefully, but it's not against other nation states. It's really against corporatocracies that I think have really become like a cancer upon society. And people from all walks of life, and I've traveled all over the country. I've been on the air for quite a few different programs. And what I find extremely fascinating is whether it's Republican or Democrat, left or right, Christians or people of other faiths or just different kinds of groups, there's one ubiquitous constant, and that is that complete lack of trust. People have learned, just by harsh experience, that the banking system is corrupt, the so-called medical industrial complex is corrupt, the agribusiness industrial complex is corrupt. Virtually everything that they've been told to believe in has now been proven to be false or certainly misrepresented. And one of the things that I really focus on is that healthcare, quote unquote, from the medical perspective, should be about preventative care, having a better lifestyle, having nutritious food, that kind of thing. And that plays a big part into the economy. And so from my point of view, and I think many others that I work with, we really need to take a second and third look at exactly how we do produce our food and in what context, and to revitalize our economy, really, using a more decentralized approach. And one of the things that I've been particularly noticing is that if you travel around, there's enormous numbers of empty buildings and or vacant lots in a lot of cities and in rural areas as well, which actually could be converted into very prolific, high-quality food and or medicinal crop production at really low cost. And so I'm not to get too carried away in the world of hydroponics, but sorry about that, somebody's calling in. But the science has advanced tremendously. This company, General Hydroponics, I worked for, actually co-founded 40 years ago, and then kind of went off in my own direction into material science and things of that nature. And ironically, 40 years later, now I'm back here again. But what's fascinating is that because I spent so much time working in nanobiology and in different kinds of nanostructured materials, that kind of thing, it actually fits in rather perfectly with what we're doing now. So I would submit that the traditional method of trying to use political avenues to cause change, like for instance out here in California, we had Prop 37, which was an attempt to put labeling on food to describe which foods had GMOs and which didn't. Now the other side outspent the grassroots side more than 10 to 1, and as you may suspect, Monsanto was a small, fairly large part of it actually. But nonetheless, it was very close, and we only lost by a few points. But what I'm trying to get at is the gap between what happens in Washington, D.C., and I've been there many times, and I've seen firsthand, directly, hands-on, how the lobbyists work. I've been on K Street. I've seen the sort of reality of how things are negotiated there. It doesn't have anything to do at all with the average everyday person. It's almost like being on a different planet. And so I don't want to disrespect people who are involved in the political process. I admire the effort, and I certainly support people who try to put their efforts in that direction. But I'm sort of more of a hands-on sort of person. I like to see actual solutions. And I don't think we have the time, frankly, to wait around for this meandering process where everything's sort of corrupted anyway. I think people should start taking it upon themselves to, in a sense, create their own future history. And certainly for younger people coming up in the world now, their future is really going to depend on how much the average person, the actual population, does themselves, as opposed to waiting for some kind of, political orientation or something like this. And that's kind of the general focus of why I'm doing what I'm doing now.
Well, one of the things that you and I talked about briefly before, we nailed all this down, and hopefully we can touch on it a bit. And I know it's not a huge focus for you, but I think it relates in some ways to what we're talking about. Is I wanted to tap you about PRISM and Ed Snowden and the NSA leaks and all that stuff, and you basically said to me that it's already old news, that the notion of privacy is a quaint notion, that everybody is and has been exposed for years. And here's where I come in with this, Charles. And I'm not trying to be cynical, and I'm not advocating on the side of the surveillance state. But let's just say, for instance, we'll play this out. Let's just say, for instance, Ed Snowden is right, and there are enough people that somehow say, okay, we want to change, and to throw the people a couple of bones. The administration changes a few things, but let's be real. There is way too much investiture in this infrastructure of the surveillance state to dismantle it, take it down at any point in time now or in the immediate future. So I think this correlates to what you're talking about with what you call food sovereignty, in that can we take down Monsanto? Probably not, but can we build models that are going to support us and influence the future? Am I correct?
Yes, thank you. You articulated that probably as well as, probably better than I could. You got that squarely on the head. But by the way, just as a sort of an anecdotal side note, there's another organization called the NRO, or National Reconnaissance Organization, which actually is much larger and much more black, if you will, than the NSA. The NSA is kind of a surface veneer for a collection of different entities which sort of interconnect. But to give you an example of this, now, forgive me, I don't remember the congressperson's name, but this happened a few years ago. There was a congressperson flying into Dulles Airport, and on the flight, he was looking down on the ground, and they were flying over Virginia. And he said, "What's that big building over there?" Because there's a whole bunch of buildings, as you all know, in this area. And he said, "I don't recognize that building. What is that?" And the aide that was with him said, "Oh, that's the new NRO facility." And he goes, "NRO, what's that?" And he became so interested that when he went back to Congress and talked to some of his congressional comrades, nobody knew what it was. As it turns out, this was many hundreds of billions of dollars have been spent building this enormous facility, and I do mean enormous, packed with supercomputers and all of the same kind of stuff that the NSA does, but on a larger scale, really. And it was completely black. There was no congressional funding trail at all, none, zero. And yet this was a building you could see from the air, half an acre or so under a roof, filled with hundreds of people and the most advanced surveillance equipment on the planet. And nobody in Congress could even come up with a funding path that said this is the bill or this is the authorization that put this funding into practice. You may also recall Catherine Austin Fitz, who's a financial expert that I've actually listened to many times and I've talked with in person. And she was at one time the co-director of HUD, and she was going through accounting procedures and said, well, there's this $2 trillion that nobody can seem to identify where it is. And she tried to go public with this, and the minute that she did, she not only got terminated, but then all of a sudden, mysteriously, she had all these troubles with the IRS and, had to go to court and go through all these difficulties, as it were. And this goes back quite a few years. I mean, this is, as I said, this is nothing new. This is all, the fact that it happened to be brought to the forefront at this moment is interesting, and I find this whole incident with Snowden quite fascinating. But the reality is, yes, this has been going on for years and years. I personally have worked on crypto systems in the past, so I have had just a little glimpse of like a slice of this sort of thing. But the concept of personal sovereignty, if I can use that, really has changed completely. We go back to an earlier time when laws were written and Fourth Amendment was sort of wrapped around physical things, pieces of paper in a file or a safe or, a physical telephone system or something like this. Those days are long gone, as we're going back decades now. And in the current scenario of things, it's not just having phrases or keywords that trigger some kind of response, and then the computer gets more interested. These have extremely sophisticated algorithms that look for patterns and behavioral patterns, and I can go into a little more complexity if you wish, but what's kind of ironic is that a lot of this, the outcome of this is not just in the surveillance world, it's also kind of wandered into the e-commerce world, because as you know, when you go online to shop or when you just travel around on the web, everything you do is tracked and traced by hundreds of different companies that sell this service, as it were, to all the major vendors. So the civilian version of this kind of surveillance is as common as sunlight. So it's just, there is no privacy. And for people that still want to see the concept of personal sovereignty as it was 30 years ago, it just doesn't exist. You just have to assume that's not the case. One small side note, and I had mentioned this last night actually, there are some forms of personal encryption that are possible, but that do not involve the internet at all. And I can go into a little bit of quantum physics maybe. I'm not sure how far I should go with this, but you can do some research on this yourself, or anyone can. But the next new thing is quantum computing, but also quantum entangled photons as a delivery mechanism for sending encrypted messages. Now, what's interesting is I saw the first version of this actually at Los Alamos quite a few years ago. More recently, a company named Magic Technologies, spelled with a Q, sold the first commercial version of this technology. And the basic concept is you can have, and I can't specify the actual distance because that's classified, but let's just pick a number, 100 miles, let's say. So from 100 miles apart, you can have two boxes, and in that box, you'll have an optical maze, and a packet of photons will be released. And by rotating the photons on their axis, the photons at the other box, 100 miles away, rotate at exactly the same time. There's no delay. There's no speed of, if we're not talking about speed of light or sending packets of information down a wire or a piece of fiber optic cable, this is actual quantum entangled photonics used as an encryption system. Now, this has been around for years. In fact, the founder of the company, Magic Technologies, spoke at one of my conferences back when I was the co-founder of nano-sig. We had these fairly large events, and so at one of these events, the Magic Technology folks actually gave a demonstration right there. You can buy a kind of a commercial version of this if you wish. It's a little expensive. But what I find extremely interesting is that just last month, NASA released a newscast saying, oh yes, we're now going to be using this quantum entangled telecommunication mechanism for communicating with our spacecraft, like as if this was some new thing. I just laughed at it because I said, gosh, guys, I saw the original version at Los Alamos years ago. And of course, now you're starting to see in some of the technical journals, aircraft can now communicate with each other via the same mechanism, et cetera, et cetera. So is there some tools out there, let's say, that if people wanted to have a truly impervious kind of way of communicating, yes, it is possible, but it's not with any of the traditional internet or sort of telecom stuff that you would think of. This is a different kind of realm using a different kind of physics, really. It's expensive, but if there's people who are truly interested in this kind of thing, you can certainly look into it, and the search terms for that would be quantum entanglement, photonic encryption, or telecommunication. You can just look it up, and there's hundreds of technical papers and things like this. But anyway, just the point is, yes, personal sovereignty is very different than what it once had been, and that's why I refer to food sovereignty, because we need to take control over what we feed ourselves and our families. What's interesting is if you look at epidemiological charts, if you look at CDC plots and graphics and so on, you can see a direct correlation between where you have lots of cancer clusters and other forms of diseases, heart disease, diabetes, etc., and the quality of food. And if you can plot this around the world, as a matter of fact, it's very apparent. What's even more fascinating is that in China, which probably has the most densely populated and polluted region on the planet, once again, you see these radical spikes, almost vertical spikes of cancers and all kinds of interesting diseases and ailments that didn't even exist or were virtually unknown up until, like, say, 20 years ago. And it plots almost exactly with the sort of industrialization and the burning of coal and all the different pollutants that are now apparent in the water and soil and the air. So, I mean, there's a very specific set of data that one can look at, and this is not a guess or a theory. It's hard fact. So if we are going to take control over our state of being, our wellness, our own sort of alternative economy, if you want to put it in that context, and our own management of our own health, I see all these things fitting together like a large puzzle. It's not any one single thing, but rather a sort of a holographic view of how to put these things together, and the food sovereignty is a piece of that puzzle.
Well, food is one of those common denominator pieces that everybody shares. I mean, it's the most fundamental thing that connects us from the cradle to the grave. And
correct.
Theoretically, it should as in quotes, be the most important piece that everyone can rally around, no matter what their political stripe is. So I think food is really ground zero for all of this, and I think you're really onto something here. Let's talk about some of the advancements that have been made in hydroponics and how it might be potentiating the nutritional value of food, and perhaps eating less and getting actually more from the food itself. Is there anything happening in those realms, Charles?
Sure, and those are precisely the correct questions to ask. And so let me just give a very brief, non-technical overview of the concept. Hydroponics, for instance, as a historical reference, actually goes back several thousand years. The gardens in Babylon and the many different ancient cultures actually utilized their versions of hydroponics, and it's not a new concept. It's just that now we have much better tools to refine the process, and we also have much better tools to really, in a precise way, characterize exactly what's happening with the plants. That is, how they are metabolizing different trace minerals and different both organic and non-organic materials, both from the root perspective, how the roots are metabolizing materials, and also how the chloroplasts, which of course are the components that convert sunlight into sugar, we work from both ends, and we spend a lot of time with different species of plants and all different. We just did a crop of potatoes, believe it or not, hydroponically. But our point is that hydroponics allows you to use much less water because, well, let me start off with this. In traditional large-scale agri-corporate, farming monocrop kind of situations, you have these enormous areas of land where the soil is essentially empty. It's just a holding material. There's no real nutritive value whatsoever. So what they do is they pump this soil full of vast amounts of NPK and various petrochemicals to sort of boost the plant growth temporarily. But the problem with that is not only is the actual nutritional content in the food almost non-existent. When you buy your tomatoes or your cucumbers or whatever at the major grocery store, they look nice, but they're sort of like hollow things. But the runoff from these huge monocrop facilities has caused dead zones in the ocean. And the reason for this is that the potassium, potash, and other materials that are often used go into the water, and the algae feed on this, and it causes these enormous algae blooms. And the algae essentially suck up all the oxygen out of the water, so that all the other ecosystems, whether it's fish and or plants and other things that live in those ocean areas, you can go on the continental shelf and find off the coast of the United States and Brazil and elsewhere, huge areas, I mean the size of a state, where you go down to the floor of the ocean, maybe 100 feet down or a couple hundred feet down, and there's nothing there, not even a starfish. I mean, it is literally a desert where there had been, not even say a few years ago, an entire ecosystem going on. So we're not only creating, in my case, what I would consider to be rather toxic food, we're also creating these dead zones in the oceans with these large monocrop sort of agri-corporate processes. By contrast, and also, of course, the amount of water that's used is just horrendous. We are sucking up water at a rate that's almost unbelievable. I belong to an organization called the Millennium Project. They're based in Washington, D.C., and we actually, as you probably know, I've been a member of a bunch of different think tanks, but this one in particular I'm really fond of because we publish a book every year called State of the Future, and myself, along with other people, contribute to our particular niche to what our specialty is. But we have this plot of the 15 major challenges of the world, and then we go through these very complicated analysis of which problems have the most influence and how they interrelate and that sort of thing. And the very top of the list is water, and I think number 3 is energy, and oddly enough, number 2, believe it or not, is organized crime. Strangely enough, the separation between organized crime and what you might call corporate crime has sort of merged together. And it's kind of hard to put this in words, but this is a very conservative group. These are top-level people from Washington, D.C. that I work with personally, and we have a branch out here in Silicon Valley. And, if you had tried to bring this topic up, say, 6 or 7 years ago, you would have been laughed out of the room, to say the least. But I think certainly since the 2008, disaster, which was the largest Ponzi scheme in the history of the planet, as far as I'm concerned, the Wall Street mortgage-backed security, that whole debacle, it has really woken people up in the sense that they have learned to not trust anything, whether it's the banking system, the treasury system, the big biopharma industries, the agri-industries. Everybody now realizes that what they're told is not the reality whatsoever, and even the most conservative people they're disillusioned and saddened and angered, but they're waking up and saying, we can't believe in any of this anymore. So when I go to these meetings now, it's kind of surprising that I can bring these topics up, and the other people in the room will be very much in the same vein of thought. So having said that, going back to the cost of health care and that sort of thing, a lot of your diseases, a lot of your long-term and very expensive health care costs are directly correlated to diet. So if you have hydroponics where you have a tightly controlled fixed amount of water that's recirculated through the system, and when you introduce the water into the system, you know exactly what's in it. In other words, it's almost like intravenous feeding, like if you had an IV tube for a person in a hospital or something like this. It's the same kind of thing for feeding plants. You're not sprinkling water over some huge amount of soil and then inoculating the soil, not just with very harsh chemistries to force the plants to grow, but also pesticides and everything else. In a hydroponic situation, you use actually a surprisingly small amount of water, and because the fact that the plant does not have to spend a lot of energy in root development, because the nutrients are right there, it puts most of its energy into the actual plant itself. And furthermore, because you have that direct control over what the plants are doing, you can alter in a very interesting kind of way the different stages of plant development, from sprouting until where they actually start producing foliage, and then they go into fruiting phase and flowering phase, that sort of thing. And each one of those steps, you can alter the trace minerals and or the ratio of different key ingredients and really tailor the plant to produce spectacularly nutrient-rich material. Almost like you can just, on a chart, you can just say, okay, if I'm growing a carrot, this is the requirement. If I'm growing a tomato, this is the requirement. If I'm growing a cucumber, this is the requirement. And there's different nutrient and or sort of cyclic processes you can apply to any one of these crops. And what I find extremely fascinating is that the thing that I'm most turned on by is this idea of urban agriculture, where you have large buildings, many of which are the foreclosed remnants of what had been commercial buildings in the past, and people are taking these things over and putting in hydroponic farms, and they're actually producing, serious amounts of very high nutritious food in inner cities. To me, this is a spectacular thing. This is a real revolution. This is not revolution with a gun or anything like this. This is a revolution with hands-on. We're going to take control over our own destiny, as it were. And once again, as I said earlier, when you plot out the health problems that you find in many areas, it directly correlates to the quality of diet, and that's sort of like a circle that keeps spinning around and around. And when people have a chance to develop their own gardens, or whether it's in small groups, even individual families, or maybe even a church group, this kind of thing, or they go to a larger scale where they literally take over a building and start putting in these farms, the results are just amazing. It's really a fast-moving, and I find this process not just happening here, but in Japan. Since the Fukushima disaster, they take it very, very seriously for obvious reasons. The water table has been thoroughly polluted, as everyone well knows, and it's continuing to be polluted. So a lot of our more recent work has actually been with some of these installations in Japan. We also have a number of installations we've been working with in Korea. And Russia actually has the largest per population of what I might call victory gardens, for a better choice of words, of any major nation state on the planet. In fact, the Ministry of Agricultural Development now uses our nutrients specifically as their primary sort of materials to do their research with. We even produce our specialized nutrients printed in Cyrillic. We actually have truckloads of this stuff that's shipped out to Russia. So I'm not trying to promote my company exactly. I'm just saying there's other people doing this as well. But just a general concept that a very small area of surface area, whether it be the rooftop of an apartment building or inside of a building or a few backyards that are connected together, that kind of thing, can not only produce enough food to feed everyone there, but they can actually have excess so they can trade and barter with other community farm entities. And it's a sort of a secondary bit of research that might be interesting. It's often the term microfarming is what's used in trade journals and this sort of thing. And in one of the major agribusiness news journals, I forget which one, Agribusiness News Daily or whatever it is, they had a front page story, this was last year by the way, talking about how the growth curve of microfarming and local farming has sprung from being almost non-existent to this multi-billion-dollar industry. And they had a graph going back to 2005. It was about $400 million total spent on microfarm equipment and/or the whole industry that wrapped around microfarming was around $400 million nationwide. As of fiscal year 2012, that had grown to $11.2 billion. So if you plot that out, that's almost like a vertical curve. So clearly this is extending, as you said earlier, across virtually every social, political, geographical kind of orientation. It's common sense. I think that's where I'm trying to go with this. In other words, people are no longer buying ideology. They want common sense solutions that they can understand and actually apply. And that's really where I'm trying to go with this.
Well, the elephant in the room, it's the dark side. It's Monsanto, and they have been enabled by the current administration and previous administrations, and now have a very strong foothold in how our food is going to be grown and distributed, to some extent labeled, to a large extent labeled. And they do this through a number of means, either through money, lobbying, or coercion, whichever one works for them, because now we're getting into the organized corporate crime syndicates.
Exactly.
And so I guess the question here is, Charles, is that whenever I think of the Monsantos or the BPs or whoever it is, these Leviathan structures that have infiltrated our economy and our consciousness, the way that they do it is that they get people below them to do things that are against their conscience generally, and they do that by offering them money or position or some perk. How does the food sovereign movement or hydroponics, how does it push back on those entities? And what kind of quote unquote better deal is being offered up to the local politician or the municipality that says enough already? We'd rather go with this. Thank you very much. Thank you for your money. And keep your muscle at bay. This is our future. Where does that shift take place, Charles?
And that's a very important question, because the social dynamics of this is really the key to this, and you articulated that very well once again. So in the mid-level, I see many people who work for, whether it's ADM or Dow Chemical or Monsanto or any of the usual suspects. The folks in the middle, they're just ordinary people. They're not terrible folks. They're trying to do their job. Most of them have kids in college, and they're trying to pay a mortgage and trying to get by, and so they go to work every day and say, okay, this is what I'm doing. So for many of these folks, it's not that they're inclined to do terrible things. It's just that they're sort of trapped in this mechanism, this sort of socioeconomic template that the vast majority of ordinary people, the 99%, folks, are sort of trapped in, myself included. This idea, though, that Monsanto uses brute force, by lawsuits and by trying to crush small farms with all kinds of overt and sometimes covert mechanisms. I mean, this is not, I can't overstate this enough. There are examples where people say, you know what, I don't even care anymore. It's worth the risk. It's worth the antagonism to say, yeah, thank you for your money, but never mind, we're actually going to do this. And certainly in smaller towns and in sort of outlying communities where they don't have quite the large political entities that they can manipulate quite so easily, that's where you're finding a lot of this sort of grassroots movement, no pun intended, sprouting up. But even in the larger municipalities, for economic reasons, they're beginning to realize that we have still, I don't care what the numbers are that you get in the daily news about the GDP or the stock market. That's totally arbitrary. It has nothing at all to do with the average person out there. You can go to almost any major city and find many, many people out of work or marginally employed. Most people don't have long-term careers. They're just sort of working temporary jobs. I mean, the gap between what they try to project as an economic picture versus what you can see with your own eyes, if you just spend a little time observing, it's like two different planets. So there's an economic piece of this puzzle that says many of the people I've talked to, they say, look, I don't even care about the larger government thing. I want to grow things that my own family or my local community can actually trust and, we can barter with by ourselves. And as a parallel to this, by the way, the whole idea of virtual currency, Bitcoin, that sort of thing, may be kind of a beginning edge of an alternative currency concept. Catherine Austin Fitts, who you may be familiar with, who's also been on Coast to Coast a number of times, like myself, she was as I said earlier, she was the co-director of HUD at one point, then exposed this mysterious $2 trillion that got her in a lot of trouble. But she's very big on this idea of a different kind of non-sovereign currency process where people step outside the usual kind of economic model. And I think that the idea of things that you can grow becoming a kind of a currency system actually makes real sense. It does, and people are trying this now. Whether or not you have value in terms of pieces of paper with numbers in the corner or coins, or have value in terms of things that people can actually use, like food, and even aquaponics, where you combine fish and other creatures along with plants, and they sort of symbiotically maintain this ecosystem, as it were. People are doing that now, and finding that they can become self-sufficient, or at least quasi-self-sufficient, and in a gradual kind of way shift further and further away from what had been a single monodirectional dependency on the large sort of corporate mechanisms to keep them alive. People are finding, you know what, if we just become less connected to that as a requirement to stay alive, we're willing to give it a try. And I think if enough people start doing this almost everywhere, even the biggest players there are, whether it be Monsanto or whoever, they can only go so far. They can't crush everybody. In other words, it's kind of interesting. You were mentioning Turkey in the previous few minutes before the show started. My first girlfriend, going back many years, was Turkish, by the way. Beautiful woman. She was Oxford educated, spoke several languages, and she was the perfect example of the westernized, very open-minded, very progressive-minded, smart woman And that's what you have in Turkey now, the young people saying, we don't want to have Islamic sort of 12th century Sharia law enforced upon us. We want to live our lives as regular people like the rest of the world. It's a really fascinating thing to observe. I mean, you have to understand, Turkey is an enormous country, and it really represents a kind of a microcosm, I think, of a movement which is spreading in different ways around the planet. So maybe, and this may be kind of a stretch, but I see us here, maybe not quite as volatile as the current situation in Turkey, but something kind of like that, where people are taking control over their own choices of medicine. They're taking a much more proactive stance on alternative remedies for different ailments. I might point out, by the way, I've been to Brazil 4 times. In one of those occasions, I was about 100 miles west of Manaus, in the very heart of the Amazon. And what was fascinating was I was living in this little village, and there was a bunch of people there. And you had 2 different groups of people sort of pursuing their research. One was botanists and plant physiology people who were trying to capture as many different species as possible, examples of them, and sending them back to various laboratories to be analyzed to see if they could find medicinal properties or things that might be of interest. But then you had anthropologists who, in many cases, spoke the language of the indigenous tribes that were there, and they were trying to learn from the local people, what few were left, their knowledge. Because, and I remember this quite distinctly, this goes back a number of years, there was a fellow there who, with a T-shirt and a pair of shorts, he was like a walking encyclopedia. He knew more about every different kind of plant and thing that was in this jungle than all these Harvard-educated botanists could ever hope to know. And he would just walk us through the forest and say, this leaf combined with this material will make a medicine for such and such, or this piece of bark, if it's cooked or prepared as a tea, we'll do such and such. And he just had this fantastic knowledge of all these different plants and different things he could harvest that actually had very credible medical aspects to it. And of course now we see combinatorial medicine where people are using sort of what you might call Western medicine, but combined with what you might call ethnic medicine or medicine from indigenous cultures. And they're discovering that actually there's some very strong credibility to this. So if there is a way to get out of this sort of health care, and I use that word very, very tenuously here, the sort of medical industrial complex, their thing is not curing people. Their thing is selling you more medicines and more treatments, a lot of which can be avoided if you simply change your diet and or your sort of life pattern in a way that avoids these health problems in the first place. And so again, I kind of stress the idea that it's not just growing food, but actually you can grow your own apothecary, if you will. And there's a number of people who are now doing this. It's become a much more prolific concept than what it had been even a few years ago, to the point now where people are taking seeds and specimens and sort of building their own archives of heirloom seeds and things that have not been subjected to the GMO sort of intrusion, as it were, and trying to preserve as much as possible. And you have an entire movement of people now all over the country who have their own blogs and their own sites, and they actually trade back and forth, and they have different strains of just about every kind of vegetable or fruit that you can imagine. And the whole idea is to protect these genotypes from being intruded upon by the sort of tsunami of GMOs that are crushing in. The thing about the GMOs that I should point out, GMOs themselves are not bad. I know that sounds a little weird, but just hear me out for a moment. I mean, genetic modification happens constantly through mutation anyway. And in fact, I live just literally a few miles from Luther Burbank's original site, where he did many years of research, crossbreeding different kinds of fruits and so forth. And I mean, that's sort of the natural way of creating GMOs. GMOs can, in fact, have very beneficial aspects if used in a beneficial way. Unfortunately, the same tools that allow you to literally go into the different pieces of genetic real estate and insert a different component in that gene to make a change or some kind of metabolistic redirection, the main purpose actually is for pest retardant. That's the number one usage for these GMOs. In other words, the theory was, can we inoculate these various crops with some kind of a gene from a different kind of crop that would make the normal pests or bugs not, attack the crops? Well, as it turns out, nature is very good at inventing its own solutions. So every time they come up with yet another version of their GMO, whatever it might be, the pests in question simply, over a couple, 3 generations, kind of evolve around that and sort of become immune to whatever it was that the GMO was supposed to be retarding, which then requires using even more horrific pesticides and even higher. It's like a vicious circle. It goes around and around and around. Well, it turns out that in the natural world, you have bugs, insects, which eat other insects. And you have, in fact, we have a whole collection of both indoor and outdoor research gardens going on. And our whole position is to actually encourage more like controlled ecosystems, where you have the friendly insects that sort of keep the unfriendly insects at bay, it were. And we also have materials that we can spray onto plants that we actually use auxins or aromatic resins that come from various plants that can then be distilled and turned into a fine mist that have no poison in them whatsoever. We're just using naturally occurring retardants that occur in other plants. This is actually vastly more effective. So again, if you're in a controlled environment, whether it be a greenhouse or a small area or inside a building, whatever it might be, and you have a very high density yield potential given the amount of surface area and the amount of water that you recirculate through the system, you can now employ these methods to use natural mechanisms to do pest control, that kind of thing, as opposed to having to use ever more extreme examples of GMO modification combined with pesticides and that kind of thing. Nature is very, it finds its own way. And the more we try to artificially pretend like we can have our way, the more nature sort of comes up with its own sort of responses. And that's the other part of the sort of mega-scale GMO aspect that I find rather frightening, because we don't know really what the long-term outcome is, whether it be the actual outcome of the species of plants themselves, who may develop other characteristics we didn't expect, and the long-term health consequences of eating foods that are ever more genetically modified. In other words, it's an incremental process. They'll change one gene here and maybe 2 or 3 other genes there, and then keep sort of adding more and changing other things around. Well, we haven't had enough data over a length of time to really see what the long-term consequence of that is over a demographic that we can then measure and say, okay, now we can trace these health responses because of these long-term GMO effects. That's an unknown. And to me, this is Russian roulette on a very large scale. So for any variety of reasons, it's sad that what is a very promising technology in terms of synthetic biology being applied for other purposes, the biggest player, of course, is in this agribusiness world. Now, on a positive side, just to kind of play devil's advocate, if I may, I actually am very fond of synthetic biology, but for a different reason, and that is that a lot of the stuff that we have in our common everyday life, our computers, our iPhones, our iPads, and all of our little gadgets and everything, the processes that are required to manufacture the silicon chips and all the other components that go in there, these are very toxic manufacturing processes. You'd be astonished at the chemistries involved. And when you're manufacturing silicon, the amount of water that's consumed in a fab, and I've actually worked in IC fab labs in the past, you have to use ultra-purified water in enormous quantities. It's actually the energy footprint for making all these high-tech gadgets is much more than the average person might realize. So there's a real interest in, instead of having to use traditional top-down chemical milling to make computer chips and that kind of thing, can we grow devices? Can we use biological mechanisms? In other words, people ask me all the time, well, nanotechnology is this new big thing, and I say, no, actually it's been going on for billions of years. Nature is the perfect example, and that's exactly right. If you go inside of a cell and have a look, you'll see the mitochondria and and the various ribosomes and other organelle components that are literally like little factories. They break apart and reassemble different molecules, and they have messenger proteins that go back and forth and sort of have these instruction sets. Well, there's a number of folks that I'm really interested in who are examining this mechanism to see if we can use biology in a very proactive way to get away from these highly toxic manufacturing processes to make things like chips and intelligent devices and things that would be part of our everyday world but don't depend upon these highly toxic manufacturing processes. So there actually is a positive side to this kind of genetic/synthetic biology realm. I don't want to cast aspersion. In fact, a lot of my personal friends here at UC Berkeley and elsewhere I think are very motivated for the right reasons. And they're, in fact, some of them are some of the staunchest anti-GMO people you'll find on the planet because they understand all too well what the consequences could be if it's used in the wrong way. But as in with any technology, there's always going to be a yin and a yang, or a plus and a minus, as it were. It's not the technology itself, but I'm going to use this word kind of carefully, the spiritual wisdom of how it's applied.
Right.
And that's where the failure of the human condition comes in, because you have the one percenters who really don't care. I mean, they have their billions of dollars and their private islands or whatever, and to them the rest of the planet is just a shill that they can take advantage of. So in my mind, you have a lot of people who want real hands-on, like, what can I do? How can I feed my family? That kind of thing. I've been to a number of sustainable living types of conferences, and as an example, this is a few months ago. Excuse me. This is in Silicon Valley. We're developing these very small but very well-engineered solar-powered sort of irrigation system components. And I had a handful of these prototypes on a table, along with some charts and just some things for people to look at. And there was all kinds of things at this event. There was several hundred people there. But people swarmed around the table. I mean, they were like just grabbing the panels and said, "I'll buy one right now," or I'll even give you advance money. I mean, when's the first product going to come out? I mean, the response was beyond anything I even imagined. I thought, okay, there'd be some interest, but it was really quite something. I mean, this was a large, like a hotel conference area, and everybody's like clustered around the table with these, solar-powered hydroponic systems. So I mean, clearly, and I would talk to people, older folks, young people, ordinary working-class folks, people that were like ex-Silicon Valley executive types. I mean, everybody you could possibly imagine. They all wanted to say, "How do I do this? Where do I plug this thing in? What do I, It was just an astonishing, like a snapshot of the idea that people want to have a way that they can connect to this process rather than simply read about it in the news or kind of get frustrated by the theory of how these things are happening. But again, I'm not one to throw the baby out with the bathwater, as it were. I think that the synthetic biology world has a lot of positive potential, and people in academia, of course, are in a somewhat difficult position because, as you well know, the major schools get funded by the big corporate interests. Yep. They make giant grants and they build new laboratories, and then, of course, they train all the grad students to kind of go their way. But even there, and I've spent a fair amount of time on some of these campuses, quietly behind the scenes, there's a lot of very smart young people who they get it. They may be there using the facilities and sort of walking the path that they're on at the moment, but they're not stupid. They understand that if the planet life support capacity diminishes, nobody wins. And one of the places that I've spent some time at, and in fact will be there again in another month or so, is something called the Singularity University. Excuse me. And this was actually started by Ray Kurzweil. And they have a full-blown program now. It's at the NASA Ames research site at Moffett Field, and I've gone there a number of times and spoken there a few times about it as well. But the idea is that now you have this cluster of people. These are the brightest of the bright. These are the super A-plus kids from all over the world, really, and these are 20-somethings who've come in from different parts of the world who look at exactly these kinds of issues. And they've been trained in all different scientific disciplines, and they're completely on top of how do we combine these different areas of science to sort of, in a combined or synergistic way, change these sort of mega corporate processes that are affecting our world. So I mean, I see this personally. I've actually seen direct examples of this. So it's an ongoing process, but there is a shift that's happening. And it's almost like a race to see who can run faster or who can become more prolific at this. But I look at it sort of like as open source agriculture, you know, kind of like in the same context as open source software. And now, as a matter of fact, maybe if I can just branch off a little bit, sorry for that pun, there's also open source hardware. And what I mean by this is you had mentioned 3D printing a while ago. Well, 3D printing is just one piece of that puzzle. In fact, we use 3D printers 24/7 where I work to make, you know, experimental prototypes and sensor containment vessels, all that kind of thing. But along with that, you also have Arduino, Pi, PICAX, and a whole bunch of these are very small, easy to use little miniature computers that anybody can buy. They're $50 or less, and then you can add other components to it. And there's literally thousands and thousands and thousands of people, mostly young people from all over the world, and they have, you know, blogs and user sites where people are beginning to build their own stuff. Whether it's a agricultural control system or their own sort of hybrid version of a hydroponics system that has its own monitoring and using smartphones to monitor the garden, that kind of thing. It's amazing on a weekly basis just to see this prolific burst of interest where young people can, on their own, with very little money, if they can program and assemble simple electronic circuits, they're doing it themselves. I mean, they're not waiting for some giant company to say, okay, here's the next thing. No, they're just doing it. So to me, this is kind of exciting. So the whole idea of open source, whatever it might be, whether it's an open source alternative currency, open source software, open source hardware, which is kind of the latest thing, and 3D printing kind of parallels into that a little bit, you're seeing a shift away from highly centralized, monolithic, top-down distribution structures to a much more granular, almost like to the individual level or small groups of people that can actually really do real things. And that is, to me, to watch this actually occur over the past, say, 2.5, 3 years, that's the thing that keeps me encouraged. That's what keeps me awake at night, and I spend 10, 12 hours a day in the lab because I see this process happening. That's kind of what keeps my blood flowing, as it were.
Well, that's totally inspirational, and it gives people an insight into areas of science and technology that can actually be quite beneficial and helpful. I mean, I think a lot of the time now we're having kind of a reflexive reaction towards science and technology because the bulk of it, or the majority of it that we see, is being created and used for either surveillance or the warscape scenario and hegemony. And I mean, these are all the things that we, you know, as a culture look at and say, well, this is terrible, this is bad. I mean, these drones are, you know, they're killing people. These genetically modified organisms are creating tumors. This is science gone too far. So it's really good to hear sort of a balanced, much more positive example of this. But Charles, we agreed that you'd be on for an hour, but this is so interesting, and I feel like you've got some more to share. Is there any way you can stay on a little bit longer with us?
Actually, I do have to go to work, but we could probably squeeze in maybe another half an hour if you want to. I mean, I can probably squeeze that in. I mean, I literally live like 100 yards from the lab I work in, but what did you have in mind?
Well, one of the things I wanted to mention or talk about as it relates to this synthetic biology, and then I also wanted to talk about water remediation and then the future of education, which I think you and I had originally sort of converged on with this.
I agree.
With synthetic biology, one of the things that we've seen is that at every cell phone and iPad and iPod and computer, there's coltan inside of these boxes and devices.
Yeah.
And coltan is a very important element to make these things go. And
absolutely.
What we've seen in the Congo and Central Africa, where a lot of the coltan is being mined, is the devastation of indigenous cultures
Oh, it's unbelievable. It's not just that. It's a whole variety. Tantalum, erbium. I can just walk down a list. Niobium. I mean, there's a whole variety of these minerals. And as a sort of a side note, you may have noticed, I'm sure other people have, that China has been extremely aggressive in taking over or in finagling their way into these various areas. And, there was this very famous book that came out called Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which talked about in these sort of earlier times, especially in Africa, the procedure is you would take, the IMF, the World Bank would sort of finance these gigantic projects, dams and other such things that really the local government didn't particularly actually want, but the warlord or the dictator of the moment, would be bribed, and then they would go into some gigantic project, and then the country would go into debt. And so the way to pay off the debt would be to give free access to their minerals and their other resources that were of interest. Right. And that model, sadly, has been sort of now multiplied to a much larger scale. And the most recent aspect of this is exactly what you're talking about, are these rare trace minerals. And much of our current technology is absolutely dependent upon these minerals. And if they don't have them, nothing works, which is another reason, by the way, why I'm so interested in these sort of biological approach, because there are sort of new breakthroughs, which may still be a few years off before it becomes something that the average consumer can see. But people do understand this. They get it loud and clear. And so they're looking at other alternative mechanisms and material systems that don't require these exotic minerals, or certainly not in the quantities that they're used now. And not just because of the fact that we have indigenous cultures being wiped out and horrible, I mean, really, truly hideous toxicities that are left over from the mining operations, but also there's a fixed amount of this stuff. I mean, there's a kind of a hidden event horizon which is sort of hovering in the near future, as India and China and other parts of the world, Eastern Bloc and so on, suddenly become these new growth consumer markets, whatever. There's simply not enough of this stuff to sort of supply all the things that would be consumed by these other markets. And everybody kind of knows this. This is like a hidden secret, and the economies of the world are kind of dependent on this fast-moving growth curve. As a sort of an economic model, one of the things I spend a lot of time with, and again, speaking with Catherine Austin Fitz and other people that I agree with along the same lines, you can't have an economic model that requires perpetual accelerating growth as its measurement of valuation, mapped against a planet with a fixed resource base and a fixed life support capacity. It simply doesn't work. And at the Millennium Project and also Institute of Global Futures and other places where I've done these kind of think tank analysis things, it's kind of frightening in a sense, because you can actually see certain plateaus where when different trend vectors sort of converge, there's a failure point. I mean, you can argue a number of years forward or backward, but there's a certain threshold where everything starts to fail rather radically. So this whole idea of a perpetual growth-dependent and accelerating growth-dependent mechanism for establishing valuation in foreign exchange and in so-called stock values, that whole model is kind of doomed in a way. It's like a giant house of cards. Yeah. And to switch to a different kind of economic model, that may be the biggest challenge of all. It's on a scale that affects the entire planet. But a big piece of this is this access to these very specialized materials that are at the very core of much of the technology that drives the economies of today. That's really a central piece of that puzzle.
Yep, exactly, absolutely, and not only that, but it also drives the military-industrial complex, and we go into countries where we say that we're there for democracy and freedom, and really all it is a veiled resource grab and trying to find more sources of coltan and some of the other elements that you spoke of. I wanted to talk to you about water, because obviously water is a very important component to hydroponics, and you've got to start off with really good water. What are some of the things that you guys do in terms of bioremediating or filtering or cleaning the water so that the plant itself is getting supercharged or nutrient-rich water, sans, arsenic, fluoride, and all the other stuff that's in our municipal water
And that's
system?
a very good question. One of the real problems is consistency of water. You know, here in Sebastopol, the water that we have wells out here, and so the water here is actually quite nice, but you can go 20 miles away and the water is horrible. I mean, it's a very, very spotty. You take water samples from all over the country, and it's just spectacular variance. So one of the very first things we look at is how do you make consistently clean or at least better quality water? And there's a lot going on. We're not directly related to that specific science, but we certainly have partners and collaborators that are. And there's several different things which are happening simultaneously. Bioremediation is the positive use, by the way, of synthetic biology, because it turns out that various microbes can, in fact, metabolize some of these really awful materials, like arsenic, for instance. And then you can just harvest the microbes out of the water, and you've cleaned the water. So, I mean, you can actually use biology as a kind of a vacuum cleaner, for a better choice of words, to convert what had been horribly toxic water into usable water. And as a kind of an interesting side note, there's several areas in Africa especially where, once again, you have these dumping sites where you have mounds and mounds of old computers and electronic stuff, junk really, that's been, you know, some local chieftain is bribed with X amount of dollars or fancy car or something like this, and they make a gigantic pit and just pile in vast amounts of this sort of toxic, you know, techno residue, as it were, and it's really hideous. I mean, hideous beyond words. But what's interesting is, in more recent times, because of the use of bioremediation organisms, not only can they detoxify the water that was polluted, but they can now actually harvest the metals and other elements that were in those components and actually sell them at a profit. In other words, the local people, it's kind of an interesting karma curve, as it were. There's a handful of examples of this where what had been these toxic waste sites at horrible cost to the local people suddenly became a profit center. They could actually, it was kind of like fighting back and winning at the same time. So that's one area that I'm very, very interested in, because I think we can certainly expand on that. There's other things which are around the corner. One of the things that really I'm excited about is a material called graphene. And as I'm sure you know, there's been many, many years now of people using carbon nanotubes and things like this. These are molecular structures, little cylindrical structures of carbon where the atoms line up in these perfect hexagonal patterns. Well, now the idea is to grow sheets of the same material that are 1 atom thick, but very consistent. And the reason that's kind of interesting is because if you can make precision layers of graphene as a filtration mechanism, and also it's highly conductive, so you can actually use an ionic process using these 1 atom thick layers of material. Right now, for instance, desalination of water excuse me, requires an enormous amount of energy because you're using osmotic pressure to push the water through essentially like molecular filters and to, you know, screen out the salts and everything else. It can be done, but it really is energy intensive. On the other hand, if you have a conductive sort of atomic scale precision material where you can have a tremendous amount of surface area per volume of water that you're being exposed, and use a moderate amount of electrical charge to pull out the ions that you don't want in the water, this really is a radical change. And so in the world of nanomaterials and self-assembling thin films and things of that nature, this is something that's very exciting. And I think in the next small 3 to 5 years, you're going to see several examples of this. A lot of this actually has come out of the military, interestingly enough. There's a real problem with water quality, you know, in other parts of the world, and even ships at sea now are using some of these more advanced technologies in submarines and so on, so they can sort of harvest seawater, turn it into fresh water, but again, using a much more efficient mechanism. But you're right, the quality of water is kind of a core issue, because when you have water that has disease-carrying parasites and that kind of thing, much of the diseases that you see in various parts of the world are directly correlated to the not just the chemical pollution of the water, but the fact that you have parasites and other things in there that just cause horrific health problems. And so when people try to use the water for agriculture, of course, these problems get magnified through the food supply. So one of our obvious reasons for doing the hydroponics is that, A, you have a much more controlled, you can sort of narrow down to a very small port, if I'm trying to use the right words here. The water is pre-filtered, pre-treated, and then sort of fed into a controlled system, as opposed to simply being used in mass to flood an area. So we're not directly related to making those types of technologies, but we certainly have partners and other people that we collaborate with that are. So I mean, there's different aspects to this picture, but you're right. The potential for using biological mechanisms and also nanomaterial related mechanisms, that's absolutely in the flow of things.
One of the things that I reached out to you initially when we connected on Facebook about was the future of education, or the state of education as it relates to the future, in primarily grade school, middle school, and even high school education. And I wanted to just tap your brain for a moment and try to have you give people an understanding or a window into the next 10 years and the technological scale that we're going to be looking at over the course of the next 10 years. And as a result of that, how on our educational systems, the kids that are now in grade school and middle school and high school are really getting the equivalent of 19th century educations in some ways. Can you kind of put this all into a context, Charles, and then
yes,
talk about
and this is going to be a little bit complicated because it kind of gets into what makes common sense versus what goes against the grain of certain political interest. And this will probably get some people sort of angry, maybe, but I think that the unions, the politicized sort of school district union sort of mechanisms have actually caused a lot of harm. I am very strongly in favor of vouchers myself personally, and I know that may be against the grain of some of your audience, but I think we need to have much more choice. The average parent who pays their taxes and so forth, they should be allowed to pick and choose where they want their kids to go to school, not be forced to by some sort of political mechanism. And in these sort of crusty, almost like Soviet Union-style bureaucracies where the emphasis is not on how well the kids are being educated, but rather protecting the bureaucracy itself. I mean, there are fantastically horrible examples. We saw the example in Georgia, of course, where they had the fake test scores to promote the schools as if they were performing better, et cetera, et cetera. And what we have are lots of kids now who are just being trained to memorize rote material so they can pass these various tests, as opposed to nurturing what they're impassioned by or what makes them more interested. I was talking about your own son, who I remember when he was a youngster, he was in urban ore, and he was looking at all these little gadgets and trying to build things, and I could see like a young engineer sprouting forth. And it's that kind of creativity that we want to harvest, we want to nurture that. And what we're doing is we're crushing the imagination and the spirit, the sort of inspirational aspects of education, and instead of replacing it by this very mechanical, do everything the same way for everybody, and just kind of have this very mundane kind of process for training people to do things that they may or may not even find useful later in life. And the other piece of that puzzle is the cost of education has become so absurd. Look, my education dates back to the early 70s. And back in those times, I could go to junior college and even go to university, and for a very small amount of money, I could take advanced courses, and eventually I got my first job at Lawrence Laboratory, and that was back in the 70s. Well, nowadays, you have to know by middle school almost kind of where your career path, whatever that's supposed to be, is, because you're talking probably $50,000 to $100,000 worth of debt to get the degree that's supposed to be whatever your pathway to employment's going to be. Well, that's ridiculous. That's silly. In an earlier time, people had a chance to kind of explore, try out different things, discover what they were impassioned by. the difference between a student that's been forced to comply to some very narrow, rigid, mechanical education process, as opposed to being inspired and pursuing what they're impassioned by, is like night and day. I often use a metaphor, if I can. In the universe, you have what's called dark matter, and dark matter represents the matter that you can't see spectrographically, but you know it's there because of the gravity that's involved in the rate of movement in the universe. And there's a whole series of theories that go into this, but there's lots of matter that we can't see, but we know it's there. Okay, so in telecommunications, there's what's called dark fiber capacity. That is, we have lots and lots of big pipe out there in terms of fiber, but it's only being partially used. There's still a tremendous amount of unused fiber. Well, if I can use that metaphor somewhat loosely, I see what I call dark human resource potential, in the sense that we have millions of young kids who are actually very smart and are very interested in exploring what they're impassioned by, but they get crushed by this very orthogonal, rigid educational process, so that by the time they're getting into middle school, maybe into high school, they're already under such pressure to figure out what it is they're going to be a major in and how they're going to pay for this ridiculously expensive education that they may not even have a chance to use, et cetera. It totally wipes out the sort of more inspirational process that education should be. And that in itself is the death of a society. When you pull the plug on the access to education that actually matches the aspirations of the people, that's like the final, sort of moment when a civilization begins to fall apart. So, I mean, if there was ever any one area that I would be particularly bent on changing, it would be that. Now, the interesting part is a lot of young people are sort of educating themselves. They sort of suffer the misery of what they have to deal with in a classroom, but they go online and they find courses that they can now have access to. There's a lot of free or very inexpensive courses that people can get online. There's other resources that are available. So it's almost like a quiet revolution going on where, once again, it's this decentralized concept where parents are forced to, send their kid to a given school or whatever, but meanwhile, sort of quietly in the background, they're enhancing the education by, other secondary resources. But again, I think it's going to require a systemic change, a complete upheaval of this very archaic, like I said, almost Soviet Union style bureaucracy system that our educational processes have been mired in, and completely uproot this thing and offer vouchers, let the schools compete for offering the better education, let teachers be hired and fired based on what they do, not by their seniority. I can tell you from personal experience, people I've known over the years who have actually gone into the public school systems and were fantastically motivated. They love kids, they love to teach, it's what they live for. But after 3 or 4 or 5 years, they get so discouraged by the political bureaucracy BS they have to put up with, they leave, and they end up either teaching in a private school or they just go into some other vocation. And it's tragic to see people who are devoted and skilled at teaching and really know how to connect to young people get discouraged just by the political nonsense they have to go through just to, sort of see their vision of how education should be. It's very frustrating. So I don't know, this is probably too big of a topic to cram into the next 2 or 3 minutes, but to me, this is as big of an issue as the other corporatocracies we've been talking about, only in this case it's sort of like the educational industrial complex, which is really more to do with political systems that have been entrenched and sort of kept in place, not because of the quality of what they produce, but because of the political processes that have kept them there.
Right, absolutely. And the conditioning of minds, or the deconditioning of minds, depending upon how you want to look at that. Charles, it's been great having you on the show and catching up and touching base and getting some insight into your world. You sound great. Excuse me. And would love to have you back on sometime in the future. If there's any interesting projects you got cooking or any interesting breakthroughs, just reach out and we'll get you back on here and talk some more. How's that sound?
Sounds excellent. It's always good to have a chat with you, even if you are halfway across the country. Here we are, so it's all good.
Through the marvels of modern technology. Thanks again, Charles Ostman.
Speaking of which, indeed so. All right, my friend, have a great day, and we'll talk soon.
You take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
That was Charles Ostman, and you can find out more about him at futurehistorian.com. That was a lucid 1 hour and 20-minute download on the state of the rise of the corporatocracy and what you can do as an individual to, in some ways, neutralize it and sublimate its influence in your life. And of course, the organizing principle, the ground zero organizing principle, is food. And it's going to be a much bigger story in the days, weeks, and months to come. The other big story, we talked a little bit about this last week, is water. And I don't know if you guys have seen this, but the head of the Nestle Corporation has been in the news lately, and this guy's a piece of work. First of all, he says that water does not belong to people, does not belong to the earth. It's a resource to tap and make money off of, just like any other resource on the planet. Now, water has long been held in this country as a sacred trust. It's interesting. There are, I did the facts. I think there are maybe about 57 privatized municipalities in the United States, water municipalities, against, I think, about 300 plus public municipalities. So the public versus private is still fairly strong on the public side, but I think that that's changing. And I think that the concept over who owns water and what they can do with it is going to be probably the greatest challenge we're going to face over the course of the next 10 years. I talked about T. Boone Pickens and how he's been buying up all kinds of reservoirs and aquifers and all kinds of water sources here in the Southwest, up through the Midwest, and all the way up to the Rocky Mountain region. But Nestle Corporation, I don't know the name of the river itself, but I believe it's in Arkansas, and the Nestle Corporation is going to begin to empty a river in Arkansas for the water. So this is a pretty serious thing we got going on here with our resources, and we're going to have to find a way to bring them on home. So food is probably the first place and the most fundamental place that you can do that. If you don't have a garden, start one. If you do have a garden, get into it, grow it, share it, get other people turned on by it. The one time that I had a garden, I really only had a garden one time in my life, but it was an amazing success story. I grew everything. I grew everything from corn to tomatoes to strawberries to peppers, fava beans, you name it. I had a blast. It was great for my kid. We had all kinds of interesting bugs flying around, bees, butterflies, ladybugs, you name it. They were all back there. And it was a really empowering experience. And I can't tell you how many smiles I put on people's faces when I would bring bags of tomatoes to my kids' school. You know, and I grew all these great tomatoes. I grew beefsteak tomatoes. I grew Roma tomatoes. I grew cherry tomatoes. I just bring them to school, and people would just they'd be all over them. And they were all organic, too. And that was the beautiful part of it. So not only do we empower ourselves, but we make other people happy by sharing that which we grow. And that's, I think, a commodity that we undersell in our human experience. It's a transaction known as joy, and we need more of it in this world, in this ever-darkening world. You know, we're seeing in Syria right now something very, very serious about to take place. Make no bones about it, we're really staring down the potential for World War III. The United States has come out and said that they are going to block the air zone over Syria. They've come out and they said that they're going to arm the Syrian rebels. And there's even been a call to empower al-Qaeda. Can you imagine that? These are the people, theoretically, that, along with the Taliban, are responsible for 9/11 and most of the terror acts on the planet. And yet now all of a sudden we're supposed to take them in and bring them home and turn them around or turn them onto our side or whatever it is that they're trying to convince me and you that this is in our best interest of. So these are very tricky times, very, very challenging times that we're staring down. And the only thing that we can do to the best of our ability is we need to up the quotient of joy in our lives. We need to up the quotient of creativity in our lives. We need to up the quotient of communication, real communication, people sharing ideas in a way that Charles and I just did today, right here on the radio program, through the marvels of modern technology. And you can do this on your own. You can do this with people that you run across in your life. You can start a conversation with a stranger. Don't be afraid to. You don't have to be insulting. You don't have to be probing. But it's a way for us to break down our barriers. It's a way for us to stay connected. And staying connected is really important. So you want to pierce the shield every now and then. Make sure you're alive. Make sure the other person in the room with you is alive as well. Because that is where it's at. As the matrix collapses around us, and it is collapsing, we need to create something new. A new world is coming, and you're a part of it. All right, I think that's it for today. I'll be back on Monday with the Monday mashup, and I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about because Turkey and Syria are on fire, as is Colorado, unfortunately, with the extreme fires that are taking place out there. And hearts and prayers go out to people that we know in Colorado. A lot of people who listen to the show are from Colorado, a strong connection with places like Boulder and Denver and other areas out there. So everybody stay strong and do your best. And I know it's kind of a replay of what happened last year and perhaps even the year before with the wildfires up there, but hang in there and we'll think about you. All right, so use your head to discern what's real, your heart to open what's possible. This is Robert Phoenix. You've been listening to the Friday Farcast. My special guest today was Charles Ostman. You can find him at futurehistorian.com. Have a great weekend. I'll see you on Monday.
We are in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in our reality occurs. We would have the overwhelming impression that we were reliving the present, déjà vu, perhaps in precisely the same way, hearing the same words, saying the same words. I submit that these impressions are valid and significant, and I will even say this: such an impression is a clue that at some past time point a variable was changed, reprogrammed as it were, and that because of this an alternative world branched off.